Good morning, everyone. It's with great pleasure that the Working Group Population and Health of the Brazilian Association of Population Studies, ABEP, begins another series of monthly online seminars, which we are calling scientific sections. They have the purpose of debating current themes which are on health and its interface with demography and related areas in a more dynamic way, with a maximum duration of 1 hour. It's important to say that in this new seminar format, we will only answer questions from the public if you have plenty of time at the end of the presentations. But you can send us your comments anyway. In this first seminar of scientific sessions, we are pleased to welcome José Manuel Aburto, who is a Mexican demographer in the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science and the Department of Sociology. He joined Oxford to hold the Newton International and Marie Curie fellowships. He received his master in demography at El Colegio de México and his PhD in demography at the University of Southern Denmark in German Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in 2020. The aim of his research is to produce novel insights on population health inequalities and better understands the link between health inequalities and social determinants of health through core demographic concepts. Theoretically and methodologically, his work follows two main strands. First, he develops and advances formal demographic techniques to measure inequalities in the length of life, and use this perspective to generate new ways of analyzing population health. Second, through these and other methodological tools, he examines the structure and social determinants of health inequalities. His work is so far examining how structural shocks like violence and more recently the COVID-19 pandemic affect population health inequalities around the globe. Today, Aburto will talk with us about the significant impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on the USA ethnic racial mortality. To debate with him in this section, we invite Professor Bernardo Lanza Queiroz from CDPLAR UFMG, one of the most important Brazilian demographers today. On behalf of the President of the Brazilian Association for Population Studies, Professor Roberto Luiz do Carmo, we'd like to say Aburto and Bernardo, thank you so much for being with us in this morning. Thank you to all of you following us on the YouTube channel. So let's start. Aburto, it's such a pleasure to welcome you in our seminar. You will have up to 30 to 40 minutes to present your ideas and findings. So it's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you everyone for the invitation to present my work. It's always a pleasure to have these links and relationships with countries from Latin America and specifically with Brazil. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I hope that you can see now my slides. So I will be talking today about what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and some indicators of mortality with a focus on the USA. But before I go deeper into the results of the USA by ethnic and racial groups, I will try to first also talk about where does the US compares with other high-income countries in terms of performance during the pandemic in indicators like life expectancy. And the motivation for these studies started really in last year. We were interested in quantifying excess deaths and excess mortality in England and Wales. And we published a paper where we also included already what was the potential impact of the pandemic on life expectancy in the country. And we received a lot of attention in this specific part of the paper. And also already a lot of groups were working on excess deaths and excess mortality estimates around the world, including even, for example, the Financial Times or The Economist and other prominent demographers and researchers. So we felt that there was this need to also complement this type of studies with other demographic indicators, such as life expectancy at birth. So what we also notice is that life expectancy is often misinterpreted in the media and is also not well understood when people talk about life expectancy. So I want to start first by defining what life expectancy is. And life expectancy is the average number of years that a synthetic cohort of newborns would live if they were to experience the death rates observed in a given period. What this means is that life expectancy is really just a snapshot of current mortality levels, and it's not really a projection or a forecast of any individual's lifespan. So it's not really what we're expected to live. It has the advantage that it provides this snapshot, this photograph of mortality in a given population or in a given country. And it also has the advantage that there is widely available data to make these type of calculations, which then can be linked to levels of population health within a country. It is a very used metric of population health. We see this often reported in academic journals and in newspapers. It has certain advantages over, for example, calculating excess deaths, which is that is comparable across countries and over time. And this stems from the fact that life expectancy as an indicator is not affected by population sizes or population age structure. Like I said, it summarizes mortality in a given year, but also using demographic techniques, we can disentangle what is, for example, what is the age or which causes of that are contributing to the observed changes that we see when life expectancy is changing over time or between groups. So I think these are like some very good advantages of this indicator that will help us to quantify what is the impact of the pandemic on population health with in mortality specifically. So of course, the first thing that came into my mind back then was that we needed to go beyond this calculation of excess deaths and country-specific analysis and focus on how can we make a study where we could compare cross-nationally what has been the impact of the pandemic and also trying to contextualize it with historical and past trends. So this was the objective that we set out back in late 2020 and 2021. And last year we published a couple of papers on what has been the impact on life expectancy from this international perspective with the team that is written in this slide. So this graph shows, this was taken by the economist, and they replicated this graph with our data. And what this graph shows here is just life expectancy in 2019 in the lighter hues and in 2020 in the darker hues, for women in red and for men in blue. So what we can learn from this graph is that, as we would expect, life expectancy among women is higher than male life expectancy in every country. But what we can also see is that most of the darker hues, most of the darker dots are below the lighter color. And what this means is that life expectancy went down during the first year of the pandemic. And I highlight here the United States, not only because I will talk about more deeply about this country later, but also because it was among these countries, it was where we saw the largest losses among males, with over 2 years of life expectancy declines. And this is huge if we compare with, for example, back in 2018, there was a paper published in the British Medical Journal where they quantified life expectancy losses for most Western and high-income countries due to a very hard season of influenza, of flu in the winter. And in that paper, to give you a little bit of perspective, the largest loss was among Italian females of half a year. And in this case, we see losses in excess of 2 years among males in the United States. So I think this just puts into perspective the magnitude of the impact so far in 2020. So some of the key findings was that out of the 29 countries that we analyzed, 27 suffered losses in life expectancy. 11 countries for males and 8 for females lost in excess of 1 year in this indicator. And many of these also ended up with lower life expectancy in 2020 than in 2015, which speaks, I think, also to these improvements that were potentially reversed if they were any during these years. We also found that losses in life expectancy were largely attributable to increased mortality above age 60, which is also in line with what we knew about the impact of the pandemic and how it was evolving. And most of these declines were also attributed to official COVID-19 deaths. So following up on this study, the next question was, okay, so what's going to happen in 2021? So historically, if we see mortality shocks, for example, the world wars or the 1918 epidemic or even other mortality crises, it's not that uncommon that life expectancy goes down and it tends to bounce back to the increasing trend or to the pre-crisis trend quite fast. So one might hypothesize that in 2021 we would see already life expectancy going back to the pre-pandemic levels. But we also see that over the course of the pandemic, there was a shifting of the mortality across age groups. While in the first year, most older individuals were hit more during the pandemic, as it evolved and also with vaccination prioritizing older individuals, we also started to see that many working age individuals were being affected by the pandemic. And we also have this question of what's going to happen with inequalities in mortality and health in general. Has the pandemic made the gaps larger? Has it made it smaller? There is this hypothesis that sometimes mortality crisis can be so strong that it actually decrease variation or inequalities in mortality. So we are also interested in this, and I will talk about this in the foremost part of my presentation, focusing in the USA. So what happened in 2021? This is a recent preprint that you can find in medRxiv, and also all the results and graphs that I'm showing in today's presentations are fully reproducible. So you're also welcome to have a look at the code and the data and play around with it. So this paper was led by Jonas Schouli, who is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. And we wanted to follow up on our study about life expectancy losses in 2020 and complement with data for 2021. So what this graph, how we interpret this graph is the following. So the upper part of the arrow is the change from 2019 to 2020, and the lower part of the arrow is the change from 2020 to 2021. So that means that everything that is in the left of this axis is life expectancy losses. Now this dot here is the average change 5 years prior to the pandemic. So in a way, we could think of this as a very naive way of what would have expected without the pandemic was this potentially this average change that we observed just previously 5 years before the pandemic. And then these numbers are just summaries of the same information here. For example, Bulgaria lost over 42 months of life expectancy between 2019 and 2021, of which almost 18 happened in the first year of the pandemic, and the rest happened in the second year of the pandemic. And we see three different stories. We see, for example, that this group, including the USA, where life expectancy in 2021 got even worse in the second year. Notably, we see most of Eastern European countries with Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Poland experiencing the largest losses overall over the course of the pandemic. And we see, for example, that in the US, most of this decline was attributed to the first year of the pandemic. Nevertheless, we did not see an improvement going back to the 2019 or pre-pandemic levels. And this happened consistently in this set of countries. Then we have this other set of countries where we see this U-turn, which means that mortality in 2021 was less than in 2020, but is still far from pre-pandemic levels. No? So it seems that mortality is going back to that trend pre-pandemic, but we still see far from getting to the 2019 levels, for example, here in England and Wales. And then we have some countries, a handful of countries, usually the usual suspects in Scandinavia, where they did not experience life expectancy losses in the first 2 years, and some of them even experience increases, very slightly increases in the pandemic. So this is just to summarize what we found in 2021, and what we were interested is also on which age groups are driving these trends. So this graph is interpreted in the same way, in the sense that the top part of the arrow refers to 2019 to 2020, and the lower part to 2020 to 2021, and is disaggregated by age groups. So these are age-specific contributions to the changes that I just described in the previous slide. And what we see are also these patterns in some countries. So for example, these highlighted cases show that older mortality above age is already kind of improving slightly compared to 2020, going back to 2019 levels, but we see still worsening in younger age groups, including working age individuals, which then speaks to these divergent patterns of mortality changes across age groups in these specific countries. Then we have these others, which are the worst performance of the pandemic of this particular set of countries. And we see, for example, in Bulgaria, the importance of younger age mortality worsening, explaining the declines in life expectancy that we documented. Similarly, in Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, where younger age individuals have been affected quite heavily. And then we have here the case of the US, where similarly to other places, the 80 plus category has gone back virtually to the level pre-pandemic in terms of mortality. But then we see this prominent impact in younger age individuals with, for example, individuals between ages 40 to 59 contributing almost a year of life expectancy lost over the course of the pandemic. So this graph was it is also included in the preprint, and it already received some attention from the media in the Financial Times. This was done by Hannah Jadla, who is a demographer in Cambridge, part of our group of collaborators. And the aim of this graph was to also contextualize how does the COVID-19 losses in life expectancy compare with historical shocks. And I think this is very helpful to put the numbers into perspective, because like I said, it's not that uncommon that life expectancy sometimes goes down, but nevertheless, the magnitude of that decline can be quite different, whether it's during a mortality shock or a mortality crisis like the one we observe. So here, every square here reflects yearly changes in life expectancy when there were losses in life expectancy, So the darker the hue, for example, in this period, the larger the life expectancy loss was. So we see, for example, the World War and the 1918 flu pandemic, the period of the Second World War, the post-Soviet mortality crisis, and we can see that the colors that we find in the COVID-19 pandemic are comparable, for example, to this crisis. So this speaks to the magnitude, to the how much the COVID-19 pandemic has affected mortality in these most high-income, low mortality countries. So then if we wanted to expand this to, for example, include other countries from low and middle income groups, it is very likely that these losses are even larger. And there's already evidence from, for example, Brazil, from Mexico, and India that suggests that life expectancy losses there in those countries were much more higher than those that we observed in this set of high-income countries. So having set the stage with what happened in an international perspective, I want to now get deeper into, okay, so what happened within countries? There's already evidence, again, from Brazil and Mexico, for example, that there is increased regional variation during the pandemic, with some states or some regions experiencing much more losses in life expectancy compared to other regions. So what we wanted was to contribute to this debate by focusing in ethnic and racial age groups in the US, by adding two new perspectives. So it was already documented by the CDC and other papers that, for example, Blacks and the Hispanic population was hit harder compared to the white population in the US. So what we want to contribute here is adding some new indicators to complement, for example, life expectancy, but also we want to add to this discussion by including information on age, patterns of mortality, and also causes of death, and specifically those causes that have been more prominent in the recent literature about mortality trends in the US. So I will talk about some concepts before I dive into the results, and the reason is that I just want these concepts to be very clear once I start showing these results and what happened during the pandemic in 2020 by subgroups in the US. So these results, I will use the example of Black men in the US in 2020, and for all those that are like starting to maybe their master's or PhD in demography, you will listen a lot these concepts of survival functions, life expectancy, life tables. So I want to just show graphically what this means. So this is the survival function for Black men in the US in 2020. And this survival function can be, for example, interpreted as the probability of surviving to certain age. For example, this point here, a little bit around 0.8, is the probability of surviving to age 50. And for example, this point here, less than 0.5, is the probability of surviving to age 75. So this survival function has this direct interpretation in terms of probability of surviving, but also if we were to calculate the area below this curve, that is exactly what life expectancy means. So life expectancy for this particular group is 67.8 years. And this again is this indicator that is widely used, that is often documented and reported in academic journals, academic papers, in policy reports, etc. So what we're interested is in how can we fill this square here. So we have, this is life expectancy at birth. Another indicator that is often reflected is, for example, healthy or disability life expectancy, disability-free life expectancy. So that graphically would be this. Now you can, for example, in the hypothesis that 70% of the population does not have any disability in all ages, this would be the value of healthy life expectancy. Now, this is not a concept that I will talk about today, but I wanted to show it graphically. Now, if this is life, everything below this line is life, that means that everything above this is mortality. It can be attributed to some mortality patterns. So what we're going to do is that we're going to set this cutoff at age 95, and we're going to calculate this area. So this white area then is what we call average life years lost. Now, so this is effectively what, according to this life table, how much years are being lost during this, according to this mortality profile. And in this particular case, we know that between birth and age 95, on average, Black men lose 28.3 years of life. Now, the advantage of playing with these concepts of life lost in this specific way is that we can actually attribute these years to specific causes of death. So, for example, in 2020, of those 28 years, 24% was attributed to cardiovascular diseases, which amount for 7 years. 2.2% to respiratory diseases, infectious diseases 2.8%, deaths of despair, which were more predominant and more prominent among the white population. We can see that they already have quite a significant impact also among the Black population in the US, with almost 3 years of life lost in 2020, which accounts for 10%. Cancer mortality, almost 13%. Accidents, 6%, and COVID-19, 10.6% of those years, which is again closer to 3 years. Now, 10% might not seem much, but it's a lot of the total mortality that happens in a country. I mean, 10% is comparable to what we observe or we attribute to cancer, for example, or deaths of despair, which are these deaths that are often grouped, for example, like homicide, drug overdose, etc. So what we're going to do is to complement life expectancy with this measure of years of life lost, and we're going to compare how different groups compare between each other and over time. Now, attached to this survival function, which I showed before, there is a mortality rate or a hazard. In this case, it looks like this. It's a bit high in infancy, then it goes down, and then it increases exponentially. So this is a known result. This is a mortality profile. And if we were to make the multiplication of this mortality hazard and the survival function, then we get what is known as the age at death distribution. So these three concepts tell the same information, just in a different way. So for example, with the death distribution, we can see that a large proportion of deaths happen in infancy for the Black population, which I think is astonishing for a country that is developed like the US. We can see that the highest number of deaths is concentrated at about age 80. We can see that there is quite substantial mortality in working age and younger individuals. But attached to this distribution, there is also variation. And we can measure this variation with some indicator, for example, like the standard deviation, the life table entropy, the Gini coefficient. So this concept is known in demography as lifespan inequality or lifespan variation. And it's a complementary indicator to life expectancy because it provides information about how even or uneven improvements in mortality are distributed across age, which can be important for just measuring inequality within a population. And this is akin to what economists do. So economists complement, for example, GDP per capita with the Gini coefficient of the income distribution. So they have a measure of centrality and also a measure of variation. And this is what demographers have done also over the last couple of decades. So we want to complement life expectancy with this measure of inequality in lifespans. So now I'm going to dive more into the results, having explained those concepts that I will be presenting today. So this graph shows the total years of life lost between birth and age 95, and then the proportion of these years that is explained by these causes of death. And we can see already some interesting results by just showing 2010 and 2019. The first one is that there's no improvements. So we would expect, if there are improvements, we would expect these years of life lost to decline over time. And we can see that from 2020 to 2019, 15 years of life lost among white females, more than 18 years among Black females, and Hispanics with the lowest number of these groups. And this is also a known result. This is what in demography has been called the Hispanic paradox. No? And this is there is this phenomenon that Hispanics have higher life expectancy or lower life numbers of life lost, while they also are part of a lower socioeconomic status. And this is why it's called the paradox, because usually socioeconomic status is a good predictor of longevity or health. And in this case, it doesn't hold. And there are like different hypotheses on why this doesn't hold. We also see that years of life lost are larger among males. And here I highlighted this because in this group, we also see like a slight increase for the Black males between 2010 and 2019. So in a way, this is a lost decade in terms of improvements in mortality, at least reflected by years of life lost. We can see also, for example, that most of this life lost is explained by cardiovascular diseases, cancers, and deaths of despair. So this also speaks to these very specific patterns, no, that we would expect associated to risk factors and also socioeconomic conditions. So what happened in 2020 is the following. So all of these groups saw an increase, a substantial increase in terms of average years of life lost. And we also see that the biggest change was observed among the Hispanic group, with Hispanic males reaching over 20 years of life lost, and COVID-19 official deaths explain more than almost 25% of those years of life lost. We can also see that cardiovascular diseases also account still for a lot of these life lost. And there is also this hypothesis that what we're showing here about the impact of COVID-19 deaths may be a lower bound, but because there is some evidence suggesting that potentially some of these cardiovascular diseases attributed deaths were not coded properly, and it might be the case that some of these were actually COVID-19 deaths. So moving on to how did life expectancy behave during the first year of the pandemic between groups. So here in this table, I just summarized the results. For example, white females went from 81.4 years in 2019, and it declined to 80.2. And this is just reflected in this graph. So we can see that the group that suffered the largest decline in life expectancy with over 4 years and a half were Hispanic males, followed by Black males and Hispanic females. No? So these are very, very large numbers compared also to the national decline that we observed in the previous slides. This is the pattern between 2010 and 2019. So we can see the stagnation in life expectancy in most of these groups. I mean, Black and Hispanic females did increase life expectancy by 0.7 years, but I think that's still a very small increase for a decade of time. So now what we're interested so this is not new. We document this, but this was documented before by other researchers, including also the CDC. So what we want to contribute to this is to explain how much of this decline was explained by specific age groups and causes of death. So this graph shows these results. So we have here, like previously, in the top row, the white population, in the middle, the black population, and in the bottom, results related to the Hispanic population. The blue color is reflects the contributions to the change in life expectancy between 2010 and 2019, and the red color from 2019 to 2020. So that means that if we were to collapse these contributions, we would get the total change in life expectancy between 2010 and 2019. And during this period, for example, we can learn that cancers contributed to increasing life expectancy in all of these groups. Even in 2019 to 2020, we see mostly positive contributions. And as we would expect, many of these part of these contributions are focused in older age individuals. Then cardiovascular diseases in some groups were contributing the previous decade to increasing life expectancy, notably amongst the Hispanic population, where these gains were concentrated in individuals above age 60. These are also, by the way, results for males. I'm just showing results for males because the magnitude of the declines are larger, but the trends look similar among females, and I'm happy also to provide this later on in the Q&A or in the discussion. And then what happened between 2019 and 2020 is this worsening of cardiovascular attributed mortality. And I think it's quite substantial, for example, among the Black population, the fact that these losses in life expectancy due to cardiovascular diseases are concentrated, again, in younger working age individuals. Similarly, among Hispanics, these causes of death contributed to declines in life expectancy, kind of reversing the progress that was observed between 2010 and 2019. Then deaths of despair, they were already contributing to declining life expectancy in all of the subgroups. And again, this is in line with previous findings that these deaths of despair are concentrated among young, especially young males. But what we observed is that between 2019 and 2020, during the pandemic, these causes of death also worsened to the extent that the losses in the previous decade are comparable to what we observed in just 1 year of change in mortality of contributions to life expectancy changes from deaths of despair. This is COVID-19 official deaths. The results are quite shocking. They're like much more higher than deaths of despair and cardiovascular diseases during the year of the pandemic. Of course, there is no blue color because COVID-19 did not exist back then. But then we can see this gradient with the white population suffered quite substantial losses due to these causes of death, but it was higher among Blacks, and it was the largest losses were observed in the Hispanic group. And many of these are also happening in very young age groups with, for example, 0.75 minus 0.75 years between in age groups between 60 to 69 and 70 to 79. So this also talks to this vulnerability of younger age groups in the US during the pandemic, especially among the Hispanic groups. And here we just have the rest of causes of death. And I think this is also an interesting result, because even though we try to disentangle the causes of death that were more important or more prominent in the literature, we see that the rest of causes of death also worsened between 2019 and 2020. So I think it's worth having a deeper look into what is happening also in these red colors here that also contributed quite substantially to declining life expectancy. So having gone through the results of life expectancy, what happened to lifespan inequality? And this I will just talk very briefly, and this really just stems from my own interest of this topic. So what happens usually or historically is that life expectancy, as it increases, lifespan inequality goes down. So what this means is that countries that at the moment exhibit the largest life expectancy levels, they tend to have also the lowest levels of lifespan inequality. So under this, we would expect that lifespan inequality should increase during the pandemic because we observed these sharp declines in life expectancy. And that did happen, which is this graph below here, that did happen in the white and the Hispanic population where lifespan inequality increased slightly during the pandemic. And it was already increasing during the previous decade. But what we observe and challenge this hypothesis is the results among the Black population where lifespan inequality declined, even though life expectancy also declined. So this just speaks to these divergent patterns of mortality impacts by age groups. So this suggests that the impact of the pandemic among the Black population was focused in older individuals, whilst among the white and Hispanic population, it was potentially more concentrated. And we saw that in the previous graph in younger age individuals. So I think from a demographic perspective, this is an interesting result that challenges this assumption that as life expectancy increases, lifespan inequality decreases, and demographers have been finding these type of results more frequently, especially when looking at subpopulation within countries. So then the other question that we were interested in answering is what is happening with gaps between, for example, the Hispanic life expectancy and the white life expectancy, or the differences between the white life expectancy and the Black population. So this graph shows this age-specific and cost-specific contribution to these gaps. So for example, in 2015, females amongst the Hispanic group had a higher life expectancy than the whites by 4 years, 3.8 years. And these 3.8 years are explained by this decomposition. So we can see that a lot of this is explained by an advantage in mortality in older ages. We can see that at younger ages, Hispanics have lower rates of deaths of despair. And we see a very similar pattern in 2019. Now, this other column shows the difference between life expectancy among whites and blacks. So whites have an advantage of 3 years of life expectancy, and everything here to the right, it means an advantage of the white population, and what is in the left is a disadvantage. So the only causes of death that where blacks perform better than the whites are deaths of despair, as we would expect, and respiratory diseases. The other result that I find quite shocking of this graph is the contribution of under 10 mortality, and this is mostly infant mortality. I think for a country that is considered high income developed, the fact that these differentials are still explained quite significantly by mortality at very, very young ages is quite surprising. And these are the same results, but for males. So what happened in 2020 is very interesting. The gap between, for example, I'm going to focus on results for males now. The gap, for example, between Hispanic and white went from 3.7 to 0.7. So basically, this gap between these groups in life expectancy disappeared. But it did not disappear because the white mortality decreased towards the level of the Hispanics. It was just because mortality among Hispanics was really affected during the pandemic. So this decrease in gaps is what I would say success of failure, really. And most of this comes from COVID-19 attributable death. So basically, the advantage that Hispanics had over the whites in terms of causes of death and mortality was offset by the increase of COVID-19 mortality in 2020. And what we observe between the white and black differentials is the opposite. So from a gap of 5 years in 2019, and also in very close to 5 years in 2015, it went up by 50% to 7.1 years in 2020. And a lot of this is also explained by an increased mortality of the black population of cardiovascular diseases and COVID-19 deaths. So I think this is a contribution to this literature of what happens during the pandemic to racial and ethnic differentials. And this, I think, adds also to the literature of inequalities in general. So to summarize, we found in this paper that all groups suffered sizable life expectancy losses and increases in years of life lost. This metric of years of life lost that is not usually used in reports, but that I think has a lot of advantages. One of the advantages is that it's consistent, or it comes from the same mortality profile from which we also measure life expectancy or lifespan inequality. It is comparable between populations and across time. And also, very importantly, we can attribute quite accurately how much of this average life lost is due to specific causes of death. And we found that in this case, mortality from cardiovascular diseases, deaths of despair, and COVID-19 explain most of these losses. I think this indicator in particular holds advantages from what is out there. For example, usually what is known as years of life lost is a metric that is affected by population size and population age structure. And I think in this case, I argue that this measure that was developed in 2013 has disadvantages over those, and also more demographic meaning. We also found that working age mortality accounted for substantial life expectancy losses, especially among Hispanic males. This other result that I think from a demographic perspective is interesting, that lifespan inequality increased for Hispanic and white people, but decreased slightly for the Black population. And finally, this result that the pandemic shifted racial ethnic mortality differentials in favor of white people by narrowing the Hispanic advantage and widening the Black disadvantage. I think this adds to these current discussions about inequalities within a country, and this framework, these concepts can be used in other countries, for example, to look at differentials by socioeconomic status, but also including this new dimension of causes of death and age groups, by educational attainment, also by regions. So I think this framework of looking at this life expectancy, years of life lost, and lifespan inequality at the same time really provide a comprehensive view of what has been the impact of the pandemic in terms of mortality outcomes. So I know there's a lot of students in the audience and that they might be interested in this type of topics. So if you are interested in that, or in knowing how also my trajectory was in terms of finding master programs, PhD programs, and so on, feel free to reach out to me either by emailing me or some other type of communication. And I will stop now, and I look forward to Bernardo's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aburto. Your work is really interesting and shocking, impactful. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to invite Bernardo to present his considerations about Aburto's work. Bernardo, you have up to 20 minutes to make your comments. Up to you.
Okay, I'm trying to make my slides show up. Okay. So thank you for having me to discuss and make some comments on the work by Aburto, Tilstra, Floridi, and all. I was very happy to read the paper, and also I would like to congratulate Aburto on his presentation. It's a really good presentation, and I hope the students learn a lot from it. I learned a lot from it, even if I read the paper before. So I just give a brief summary of the paper. It's analyzed the impact of COVID-19 on life expectancy by race in the US. And the paper adds to the previous literature. So there's some, as Aburto mentioned, there's some work by Noreen Goldman and Elizabeth Wrigley-Field on the impact of COVID mortality in the US. So it analyzed lifespan inequality, years of life lost, and also I think one of the main contributions of the paper is the comparative analysis of a specific cause of death to change in life expectancy by racial groups in two periods, 2010 to 2019, and then from 2019 to 2020. And the paper identifies the impacts of COVID-19 mortality by race, and also show the impacts of the other causes of deaths. It tackles an important and timely topic using an appropriate decomposition approach as based on the model by Horiuchi and Wilmoth, and does it with the best data available. it makes an important contribution to our previous knowledge. And as I mentioned before, adding cause of deaths by age it's a major advancing of understanding the racial disparities in COVID mortality and overall mortality in the US. I also would like to mention that I really appreciate the detailed data analysis, data visualization, and also it's a great example. Aburto is one of the leaders on this, the GitHub repository with data and files that allow for complete replication of the study. So I have a few comments. So I think my comments might be related. So my guess is that some of my comments are related to the target journal, but I'll talk about them a little bit here. So I think that the results and the discussion, they are really important. So the paper should aim for a wider audience instead of only demographers. So the results brings to a relevant discussion and they are really important. But some, like Aburto started his presentation talking about life expectancy, and this is an ongoing debate on how people interpret life expectancy, and especially how people interpret the impact of COVID mortality on life expectancy. So as Aburto and Ilia pointed out in several places, I think it would be important to have some additional information to help a wider audience to read and to understand how we analyze life expectancy, especially under the context of COVID mortality. So the paper has one paragraph about it and still use the terms as synthetic cohort. So there's very demographic term. So one suggestion is to add some additional material on GitHub or online appendix that would help the readers of the paper. Also, one question is a little bit of an explanation on why do you decide to use Horuyuchi and Wilmoth decomposition method instead of other ones like Pollard, Beltran-Sanchez, or Vaupel and Canudas Homo, that would also allow you to disentangle the impacts of mortality by cause and age. And I don't know, I think this for me, it's like I have preference for one or another, but I would like to listen a little bit on the choice and what you think of the advantage of using this approach instead of the other ones. And also in the methods, I would suggest a little bit more information. So in the paper, you refer to a previous paper using a similar method, but the paper you cite, it doesn't provide a very detailed description of the method. So I'm thinking of a wider audience that would be interested in the decomposition methodology, especially since you provide all the files in the repository that would help people to replicate and to apply the method in different contexts. Some comments on the background. So as the paper points out, the US trails other developed countries in the levels of mortality. I think one very important result is showing the impact of mortality in working age population and the increase in mortality by cardiovascular disease, but also the impact of COVID mortality on working age population. And this talks a lot with a recent paper was presented last PAA, some people from the World Bank, Gabriel, I forgot his last name, Piedad Dinola was involved in the paper as well. And they show how the COVID mortality is flatter for a lot of less developed countries. So it doesn't follow the same mortality profile as we see in more developed countries. And for some population subgroups in the US, it's very close. Also, there's one point that would be interesting to study. It's not a comment to do it in this paper, but one of the US, like there's a paper by Fenelon in 2010 showed the divergence process in mortality when he compares regions and states in the US, and these regional differences explain a lot why the US falls behind when compared to countries with the same level of income or development. And then there's this recent analysis on excess mortality across counties in the US, and they show a wide regional variation. So I think it would be a very interesting idea to look not only at age and cause, but also at the regional dimension, so we could understand better what really happened to the US. And also, I think this way of analysis would be very interesting to other large countries in the region, like Brazil and Mexico, that were hit really hard by the pandemic and are also marked by very wide regional variation, and would be an interesting analysis. And in the case of the US, following on this paper, would contribute a lot to understand the racial disparities in mortality in the US. So some minor comments. I think would be interesting to have some additional discussion on data quality for racial groups. So in the paper, you point to some limitations, and in the presentation, you also mentioned that how some cause of deaths could be COVID, but were registered at different cause, and also for this information, a little bit more detail would be very interesting, and I think a contribution. I think the paper could explore a bit more the difference by gender. So there's a lot of interesting discussion and important discussion on the difference by race and ethnic group, but comparing the gender would be interesting. So I think would be an interesting contribution as well. And also on the final discussion, it would be interesting to try to understand what's happened in the US that impact this population more, impact specific subpopulation groups and age on the COVID mortality. So access to healthcare and vaccinations rollout, access to testing, and other variables that would help us to understand the results you show on the impacts of mortality and inequality. And also, I was thinking maybe it would be interesting to use the model age of death to study the difference. I was thinking of that based on the recent paper by Viorella Diaconu and colleagues, that they suggest the use of the model age of death to analyze inequality. And Diaconu and other colleagues in the previous paper also compared the model age of death by cause of deaths, and apply this methodology to investigate and analyze the social difference and inequality. And then you can add not only the model age of death, but include an analysis of the disparity across model age of death. So I think this would be an interesting analysis and contribution to this, the impact of the COVID pandemic on the mortality levels. And to close up, so we can have a chance to discuss. So I think this paper makes an important contribution, and especially by adding cause of death by age. This is a major advance. It opens the door of similar research to other countries. I was thinking Brazil, Mexico, and India, for instance. I think Ashi Gupta was doing some related work on India. And also I would like to highlight again the GitHub repository that it's really nice to be able to read the paper and see the replication files and be able to work with them. So I really would like to thank José Manuel and the ABEP for organizing the event. I think this is a really important contribution and has a lot of follow-up research based on the results presented here. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bernardo, for your comments. Aburto, would you like to say anything else?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you, Bernardo. It's always a pleasure to see you, to hear your comments. Obviously, I take very, very seriously what you said, coming from one of the experts in analysis of causes of death and data quality and all these different, all this research that you have done. I guess we can have the methodological discussion. So I've tried the different decomposition methods in terms of life expectancy differences, and the results are virtually the same, whether we use cost-related life tables like Iran, Beltran Sanchez and colleagues, or the Arriaga method or the Dasgupta method. I guess the reason why I like the Ryuchi one in this particular case, or one of the advantages is that we use the same algorithm to disentangle changes in any indicator, right? Like so for example, the Arriaga method or the Beltran Sanchez methodology can be applied only to life expectancy. So we would need to work out a similar way to do, for example, lifespan inequality or years of life lost. In a way, this algorithm that is based on this idea that that indicators change gradually over time, I think it's just consistent that we can use the same decomposition method for life expectancy and lifespan inequality by age or causes of death. So that would be one of the advantages. The other advantage is that the only thing that this method requires really is a vector of rates, and that's how we usually work. No, as demographers, when we're working with mortality data, we usually have a vector of rates by cause of death. So it's also very easy just to implement this methodology. And of course, here, thanks to like Oriuchi and colleagues for developing it, but also to Tim Rife that has put all this already in an R package, that is very easy just to implement. So that would be my answer to why did I choose the Oriuchi method, the integral method in this particular paper. Now, going beyond the methodological discussion, all your points are very well taken. I think a next step would be to look at regional variation in the US, and like you said, also in other countries that were hit even probably worse by the pandemic, including work that we have been doing, the group in CEDEPLAR about Brazil, but also the group in for example, Colmex about Mexico, like these state level differences explain a lot of the variation, and we see these differential impacts quite marked depending on the region, which is also usually linked to potentially some socioeconomic variables. So I think that's the next step to move forward would be to look into regional variation, maybe try to complement or make some correlations with the work by Andrew Stokes and colleagues, now that they have county level information on excess mortality, and also a recent paper looking at causes of death with age standardized death rates. I agree with you that there's just very little in terms of data quality for racial groups in the US. At least I try to look at literature in this respect, and there's not a lot. A lot of the papers make the same disclaimer that we do, is that, we're sorry for other groups, the data is just not really, either counts are very low, or we need or data quality is not good enough. So I think this opens just this new avenue of research to have reliable estimates for other ethnic groups in the US specifically, maybe using the work done by Gonzaga and Schmertman or Monica Alexander, like trying to get this, or the Topals, trying to get this reliable estimate of a mortality profile, overcoming these quality limitations that we see often in our countries, but in this case also in some racial and ethnic groups. Similarly, the cause of death attribution, more studies are needed also on looking at multiple causes of death. Maybe with that we can overcome a little bit this limitation about that we don't know really how many, for example, COVID-19 deaths were attributed differently, and whether there are differences between females or racial groups in these differences. I agree with you about we just need to educate better the population in general about these concepts that we work with, like life expectancy or lifespan inequality, or just the stationary population assumptions. So in the first paper, in the IJE paper, we do provide a lot of information on how to interpret it and how not to interpret it. So I think it's a good idea maybe to put it in the GitHub repository, or in some part in the appendix, that we should how to interpret life expectancy and the limitations. Thank you for your comments on replicability. I have to say that I follow the example of Jonas Scholey, like he's the one that has been teaching me this. So if you look at all of the papers that were shown today are fully replicable, and most of it has been developed by Jonas, Ilya, and colleagues. So I give them credit for that. And then finally, yeah, model H data and other indicators. Yeah, I completely agree. I think well, we should use our tools as much as possible to provide information on how the pandemic has changed mortality dynamics. And I agree that the model H there has become more useful as populations have really increased longevity, and that now is also more concentrated in certain uh, ages. So definitely, I would be very interested in following up at looking at different indicators, but maybe also many PhD students or master students in the call or that we know can also start taking these topics now further than what we have done so far. It's really basic so far. So definitely there's room for improvements and even deeper analysis. But thank you, Bernardo, as always. I'm very happy to hear your comments.
Okay, thank you, Aburto. Bernardo, would you like to say anything else?
I just would like to thank Jose Manuel, and I think a few years ago we had some discussion on the composition. I'm not sure it was with you or Vladimir on the
well,
way.
I know which the composition Vladimir would choose.
Yeah.
The one with his name on it.
So I don't recall if it was with you or with him that we had this same type of conversation. But yeah, I agree with, and yeah, as you mentioned, Team Rife has created a package for the Horyushan Wilmot, and it's very helpful. And
yeah, so that's comparable to the also the one that was developed by the Andreev et al. No, the group in Max Planck, not this replacement algorithm. Of course, these algorithms come with computational power, which is something that we faced in the life expectancy paper. And in that paper, we actually used the Arriaga method because a lot of the calculations that Jonas did rely on simulations. So then if you want to have confidence intervals for all this decomposition, it becomes very computational intensive, in which case a simpler decomposition method then is more useful.
And I think this, as you mentioned, like some I think there's a lot of important discussion and like to understand the racial difference in the US and the contribution of mortality, and the results open several doors of future research and for people interested in so I think this is one really good contribution of this work, is that you raise several follow-up research questions that would help us to understand. And also it's a direction. So in the case of Mexico and Brazil would be very interesting. And there's some other data limitations, but the main problem is, we have some results. So overall mortality, and Victor and Iran did some analysis at the regional level, but like this complete analysis would be very helpful to fully understand the impact of the pandemic in the country.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that is just, the reason why these studies include only high-income countries is not because we don't want to include other countries. It's precisely what you say. No, sometimes we have to wait 1 year or 2 years for data to become available, and even then, the quality of the data is questionable. And so we need to actually use more these demographic tools. No, all the DADM methods and all your development. No, that we usually don't use in high-income countries. So definitely, it's more challenging, but it's needed.
Yes.
Okay, thank you again. I think we are now getting to the end of our seminar. I'm sure it was such a fantastic beginning for our new series of seminars. A really interesting and insightful presentation, the high-level debate. So thank you all, Aburto and Bernardo, for sharing with us your ideas. I'd like to say thank you to Vinicius, our computer science technician from Universidade Federal dos Vales do Jequitinhonha e Mucuri, the university I work for giving us his technical support in this transmission this morning. And of course, thank you all who follow us on YouTube. Before leaving, I'd like to say that our next seminar will be probably by the end of May with Elisenda Renteria Pérez from Centro de Estudos Demográficos in Barcelona. I look forward to seeing you all up there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, people.
All right.